This is the fourth and final webinar in the Google Apps for Education 101 webinar series, and today we'll be covering marketing and project planning. And my name is Ariel Hathaway, and I am a member of the Google Apps for Education team. So we'll just go ahead and jump in. Okay, so for the agenda for today, we'll be doing a recap of some of the topics that we've covered in the prior webinars, just to give you some context on when we're talking about project planning, some of the things that you'll be considering. Then we'll go into project planning itself, getting the word out, so that's marketing to your users, and then also training your users. So just as a quick recap, you would probably begin the project planning section once you pitch Google Apps at your school, so you have buy-ins from some of the key stakeholders at your school. Of course, it can be helpful to have some preliminary project planning done before you pitch to these key stakeholders, so that way you can say, this is the timeline that I'm proposing, things of that nature. But please note that most people will do the pitching first and see if they have some buy-in before they will begin their actual project plan. They may have a preliminary project plan in place, though, before. So you also will want to take a look at the various options for your deployment. So last week we had a Google Apps for your EDU deployment webinar. So I'll be working on getting all these posted after the webinar series completes. So it completes today, so I'll be working on getting those posted, and I'll let you know once they are. But I would definitely recommend taking a look at that webinar, taking a look at our resources that are online for deployment, and then having some plans going forward for how you'll be doing your deployment, what type of deployment you'll be doing, etc. And then also you'll want to have signed up for a Google Apps account, either using a test domain or your production domain. So again, you're going to need to have somebody who has control over the DNS for this domain assist you with this. So if it's somebody else at your institution, then you would want to be in contact with that person. So once you have those things done, you'll start your project planning. And during this section, we'll be going into important considerations to make, selecting your deployment timeline, and then creating your actual project plan. So, important considerations to make. Some of the most important considerations to make are how are you going to address the technical aspects of the deployment. So, you need to have a plan for how you'll be provisioning users, migrating data, authenticating, and then what you'll be choosing for domain name and mail architecture. So choosing your domain name and mail architecture is something that you would likely have, if you've signed up for your primary domain, you will have already had that done. But choosing your mail architecture, it's going to depend on the type of launch that you do. So again, if you're doing some sort of dual delivery, you need to take that into account, whereas if you're changing over your MX records on a certain date, then that is, you just need to know that you're doing that on that specific date. In terms of provisioning users, you should have an idea of how many users you need to provision, because that way you can plan for the correct amount of time to provision users. Obviously, if you're provisioning more users, it's going to take some more time to do that. So you'll want to know whether you're doing CSV uploads to provision users, whether you'll be using the Google Apps Directory Sync tool, or whether you'll be using the provisioning API. In terms of migration of data, when you're migrating data, you want to be able to, if you are migrating data, this is something that you want to take into account because you want to allot for that time. A Google Apps deployment can be very straightforward, but migration of data can make it more complex as you are working to get data from one system into another. This also depends on the type of system that you're on, so some systems are easier to migrate from than others. And then authentication is very important because certain types of authentication, so if you're authenticating straight to Google, you're just syncing passwords to Google. That's the most straightforward type of authentication and is the easiest to accomplish. However, we see a lot of people who do opt to use single sign-on, and when you're using single sign-on, that is a more technically complicated process, and because it's a more technically complicated process, we do see that people will tend to need to allot more time for that. So that's an important consideration to make early on. And then also we recommend making sure to communicate to the key stakeholders in the project at various points in the project. So if you've decided that these are the ways that you think you're going to be provisioning users, you want to communicate this to your key stakeholders and let them know about how much time you think that'll take. Just so that way everyone has the correct expectations in terms of when things are going to be done and is on the same page. Communication is really vital during your Google Apps rollout, just to make sure that everyone is well informed and feels as though they're being kept in the loop. So next we'll talk about selecting a deployment timeline. So in terms of selecting a deployment timeline, some of the things that you'll be considering are, what type of launch will you be doing? Again, we see schools that will do what's known as a big bang or full cutover launch, whereas as of a certain date, everyone is going to be on Google Apps. We also see schools that will do opt-in launches or phased launches. So with an opt-in launch, you're having people opt in, and then you're saying on a certain date everyone will be on apps, but they have more time, so these launches will typically take longer. And then you'll also have a regional or phased launch. So a phased launch is going to be more of, we may go department by department, something of that sort. And if you choose to go department by department, the timeline is also up to you, but it tends to take longer than a full cutover launch. So you need to think about whether it'll be 1 week, a 4-week, 6-week, 10-week, or 12-week deployment. Of course, you can always have anything in between those as well. And we have certain recommendations for deployment timelines, but really based on your needs, you can decide what works best for you. We've seen schools that have done, a number of schools that have done 6-week deployment timeframes. For higher education, there is a 6-week deployment guide on our eduguide.googleapps.com, and there's also a 10-week version of that as well. Some schools may opt to take longer, but we have had schools go in less than a week. So really, depending on your situation and depending on your needs, you can do a deployment as fast as you want or take more time to do it. From the K-12 perspective, the deployment guide gives you 8 steps, so you can say, I want these 8 steps to occur in this amount of time. Another important consideration to make when you're deciding what your deployment timeline will look like is whether or not you'll be using a partner. So if you are doing some technically complicated integrations, if you want some extra assistance, and you decide to use a Google Apps partner, then it is important to take that into account when you're coming up with your timeline. We generally recommend, if you are using a partner, getting them involved early so that way they know what your timeline is and they can make sure that they have the allotted resources for your project. Particularly if it's, towards the end of the summer and they may be busy with a number of other schools that are getting ready to go onto Google Apps. And then also you need to take into consideration, are you planning a launch for a specific time? Do you want it to be at the end of the school year, at the beginning of the school year, right after spring break, right after winter break? Those are important considerations to make because you want to make sure that you're planning for, you're setting your deployment timeline to plan for this rollout. If you see that you're slipping, then you want to make sure that you're able to reconcile those differences so that way you can still launch for whatever time frame that you think is going to work best for your school. And in some cases, we'll see that schools are more hesitant to go during the middle of the semester, but at the beginning of the term or the semester, it's much easier for them to go. So this is, now we'll talk about creating a project plan itself. So when you create a project plan, you want to assign roles and responsibilities, assign due dates for the different tasks that you have. We recommend using Google Docs for your project plan, so that way the members of your project team can collaborate very easily. They can see any changes that are made. They can see the status of other people's progress, things of that nature. So definitely, if you can do it in a Google Apps spreadsheet, that's great. Additionally, you can share this out to your key stakeholders so that they can see the project status as well very easily just by logging in. And then eduguide.googleapps.com, this is what I mentioned during the last slide, but this is a really great place in terms of finding those recommendations in terms of what we recommend doing on a per-week basis or the different steps that you need to take for your deployment. So that way you can outline them. So I just have a sample project plan below. So you can see that I have the components, so whether it's technical or documentation or training, things of that sort, you can basically have your different components. That way you would know who to assign things to based on what their role is in the project. Then I also have the task, so that's what actually the person is going to be doing, the start date and the end date, the percent complete, and then the assignee. So this can be, would be more in-depth for most schools when they are going to create a project plan. This is just a sample project plan here. So you can see that the first assignment is, for Ashley, is a technical component, so she's configuring the production domain, time zone, service settings, things of that nature. So that's supposed to be done by tomorrow, and it's 75% complete. So hopefully as of tomorrow it'll be 100% complete. Another technical component, so provisioning users, they're allowing 1 day to do that. So that'll be starting on Friday, ending on Friday. It's not complete right now because it's not started yet, but Ashley will fill this in with a percent complete on Friday. They'll be running the Google Apps Migration for Exchange tool starting next week, so it's 0% complete right now, but by the end of next week, or throughout the course of next week, we should see that getting more, the percentage getting higher and higher. And then for documentation, we have creating a frequently asked questions site. So that started a couple weeks ago, and the end date is May 1st. So we don't have the launch in here, but based on the fact that the site is due May 1st, I'll say that it's a May 1st launch. So it's 50% complete right now. That's not bad. We still have a month to go. But we can make sure that John is keeping abreast of the fact that the rollout is coming up in a month, so he does need to be working on that. So in a lot of instances, this can be really helpful just in terms of making sure that you have very specific goals for specific dates. This means that it's easier for your project team to see, oh, it looks like this task isn't being completed, or it's only 25% complete and it should be 100% complete. Why is that? So it keeps everyone accountable for the parts of the project that they're working on. So you see this as being really effective in making sure that your project team is moving forward towards that Google Apps launch. So this is kind of project planning / getting the word out. So one of the aspects of project planning is going to be, and your implementation is going to be, how are you going to customize the domain? Are you going to be uploading a logo that your users will see when they're using the services, things of that nature? But then we'll also get into getting the word out more. So it's not just about that logo and branding, but it's also about creative design and public announcements to your users. What you can see below is some of the logos that schools have used for their Google Apps domains. So there's Slug Mail for UC Santa Cruz students, Aggie Mail for UC Davis students, and then you have Bronco Mail. So one of the important things here is that you want to make sure that when you're branding Google Apps, you're branding it in a way that will jive with everyone who's using it. So you need to consider who's going to be using Google Apps. Is it just faculty, staff? Is it just students? Is it just alumni? Or is it some combination of these three? When you're considering that, it's just important to know who's going to be using it, because faculty and staff may have different reactions to certain logos or certain branding than students or alumni. So once you've made that decision of who's going to be using it, then you want to think about how can you incorporate your school's identity into your use of Google Apps. So do you have a mascot that you can use? Are there certain motifs that are affiliated with your school that you think would be useful? Is there certain alliteration that you could use to brand? If you can really kind of try to capture your campus spirit and campus community, then this can be really useful because it can make people more excited to use Google Apps and also make it feel more personalized to them. Another important consideration to make here is whether or not you're rebranding your current email system. If you are rebranding your current email system, then you want to make sure to communicate this to your users. And you want to communicate early and often in terms of this to your users. So some reasons why schools may think about rebranding their current email system is because of the fact that there may be a perception of their current email system that's not positive. So they want to do this rebranding, re-unveiling of a new email system so that people will start using the email system. Say everyone is forwarding to another address right now. If this is the case, then what you'd want to do is you want to communicate how you'll be rebranding, because if you're changing a domain name, for example, you want to make sure that this is very clearly communicated to your users so that way they can communicate to anyone who may be using their email address for any types of communications, they can communicate to these users, to these people who are responding to them, that their email address will be changing. We found this to be particularly pertinent in the higher education space because if you are thinking of changing your domain name, for students, for example, and they already have their resumes out for jobs or for internships, then you're likely to get pushback if you haven't communicated it well early on, because they would then not be able to receive those emails unless you're adding a domain alias or something of that sort. So domain name is really important. You may choose to use a domain alias to keep a certain domain around for a longer period of time, but it's just really important if you are thinking of rebranding your current system. So we'll talk about creative design. So some aspects of creative design. So making a website. So making a website, you can have a landing page that outlines the switch to Google Apps, why you're switching to Google Apps, and what the key benefits of the platform are, how people can use it, when the launch will be, if you're doing a phased rollout, which departments will be going on which dates. Basically just outlining what your project plan is at a high level for the people at your institution. From this, you can also have links to the Google Apps services. So you could have links to this is how you access your Gmail, this is how you access Docs, things of that nature, so that people can easily get into the system. From here, we'd also recommend that you create a frequently asked questions page. But one thing is we have a lot of resources within the Google Apps Help Center. So when you can, point to the Google Apps Help Center for that information. You could outline what the frequently asked question is, but then put in a link to our information. That way, if we change anything, you don't have to worry about duplicating that in your documentation. It'll be updated on our end in our documentation. Frequently asked questions pages are something that are extremely useful when you're rolling out to your institution. You can reduce help desk volume. It can really make people feel more comfortable. You can also put in links to the Google Apps Learning Center, so if people are not familiar with Google Apps, they can look at some of our videos and tutorials on the Learning Center, so that way they can familiarize themselves with it. Still on the electronic side, you may think of some electronic ads. For example, if you have television screens that display messages in your campus center or in the hallways of your school, you may think of having some electronic ads for Google Apps on those monitors. Additionally, in your computer labs, you could change computer backgrounds to say, Google Apps is coming on this date. So once you have your logo created, you can really play around with the creative design aspects to incorporate your logo into these desktop backgrounds or these websites, things of that nature. Additionally, you might want to think about some tangible collateral. So the electronic will reach people and allow people to see that switch to Google Apps, but the tangible collateral will be things that people can hand out or post in various places of the school. So posters, banners, flyers, things of that sort. We have on the eduguide.googleapps.com, there are great templates that you can use and you can customize for your school. So you can download them, customize them, have them posted, print them out. You can have them, if you're a higher education institution, you can have them in dorms, you can have them on students' doors, things of that sort, just so that you're really communicating the change and making sure that the word is getting out to your community. Once you've put that effort into a Google Apps deployment, you want to make sure that you're communicating because you want to make sure that people are actually using the system. So making sure that people are using the system is a very important part of the deployment itself. Also, depending on your budget at your school, you may think of having T-shirts, bookmarks, pins, other types of swag created. There are some templates, things like that, so you could use some of the templates on the eduguide.googleapps.com. That is an option. So you can use some of the templates. You can also order. We have an online website where you can order some T-shirts, things of that nature. So you can consider doing that, but you can also print these on your own. So you may have contests where people are able to create logos, create advertisements. So you're really involving your community in the switch to Google Apps and communicating it to them in a way that makes them excited about the switch and gets them involved. Have contests to come up with logos or to come up with taglines, anything like that, anything that's going to involve your community. Additionally, we really urge you to try something unique. A lot of times when people hear the name Google, they think of, fun, unique place to be, or unique place to work, and unique products. So use that to your advantage and think about how you can have unique marketing at your school. If there's a rock that people spray paint with events, think about if you could use that to advertise Google Apps and how to sign up for a domain. Depending on the culture at your school, different things are going to go over well with the population. So you want to do something that's going to resonate with the population at your school when you're trying to get the word about the switch to Google Apps across. Additionally, if you can have some sort of party on the day of your launch, maybe raffles, have people sign up for accounts. So you'd have computer stations where people can sign up for accounts. Start using them. Have people to ask questions if questions arise from any of the users. This can be really great in having this become a campus-wide event that people are excited about and are getting engaged with in various ways. So then another important aspect of your marketing is public announcements. So there are various ways that we see schools doing public announcements. So you can consider doing a press release. So if you have press release, you can release that. If any local newspapers pick it up, you can communicate to the media, things of that nature. Also, having an article in a student newspaper can be great advertisement as well. And again, if you're having some type of event, advertise that event in the student newspaper. If you're running a pilot, then you could tell the person who's interviewing for the student newspaper who's been part of the pilot. What can they tell you about Google Apps? So leverage those pilot users to be people who can be quoted about the switch to Google Apps in terms of how they found the transition, what are some of their favorite aspects of the switch, things of that nature. Also think about using web properties. So can you update your school's website with information about your switch to Google Apps? If you're a K-12 institution, this could be really helpful in alerting parents about the upcoming switch. If you're a higher education institution, then this can alert parents, students who are on the website, prospective students who are on the website. It's just a really simple way to communicate to a large community. We've also seen schools that will post on their single sign-on page. So if they are using single sign-on for another system, what they'll do is they'll post it there to say, as of this date, we'll still be using the same single sign-on, but when you log in, you're going to be directed to a Google Apps login page. So just to make people aware, and when they keep seeing the information, the change is actually going to stick in their heads. And then email blasts. So you want to make sure to communicate early and often with your community. One of the aspects that's really important with a Google Apps launch is the change management aspect. So the change management aspect can be made a lot easier when you're communicating frequently to your community so that they feel like they're involved in the process. So if you're sending out email blasts, maybe send one 2 months before or when you decide to make the decision to switch to Google Apps. And then, maybe a month before, 2 weeks before, and then on the date. Again, it's something that people may not read the one that was sent out 2 months before, but 2 weeks before, that gives them some time to prepare, and also you could put in, these are some actions that you would need to take before our switch, if they do need to do anything on their end. So here are some examples of getting the word out in marketing. So at Northwestern, there was an Are You at You campaign for Google Apps. So they had bookmarks with pins created and then posters and t-shirts. And then, so that's on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the things that were created for Abilene Christian University. So they created t-shirts and they marketed their switch G-Day. So on G-Day was when they were switching to Google Apps. They had outdoor signs, they had posters, things of that nature. Again, you can brand this for your school and you can say, I want to have this be a huge event on this day, and this is how we're going to get this word out. If you have limited budget for things like t-shirts, or if you're not sure whether to make them, you could make them for people who are work at your help desk, for example, and have those students wear it around. It's still going to create that excitement, and then possibly raffle some off at the event itself. So again, I mentioned that change management is one of the most important aspects of a Google Apps deployment. So some ways that you can work to train your users is that you can assemble Google Guides who are going to help deliver training and ongoing development to users. You want to set the scope of the training plan and conduct the Google Apps training itself. So some considerations to make when you're going through this process is, are there timing conflicts for vacations and exam periods? Typically, when you do have timing conflicts for vacations and exam periods, you're going to see that it's going to be harder in terms of that change management piece. If you're asking professors or teachers to attend training during a time that they're supposed to be administering and grading exams, you're probably not going to get huge attendance during those time periods. So think about that when you're scheduling trainings. Review the training material on eduguide.googleapps.com, and also take a look at some of the other apps for education resources that we have. A number of our partners will also deliver trainings. So if you'd like to, you can always hire a partner in order to deliver trainings for you, or to do train the trainer session. We'll talk about some of these things in more detail. So when you're assembling a group of Google Apps guides who can help deliver training and ongoing development, you want to do a few things. You want to select these guides so that you're going to have a wide reach. You might have, if you're a higher education institution, you may have one Google Apps guide in each department. If you're a K-12 institution, you may have one Google Apps guide for each grade or for each wing of your school, something of that sort. What this person does is that they're going to be the point person for questions that come up regarding Google Apps. So again, this can be more of a train the trainer model. So you would train these users, and then these users are going to be the points of contact instead of users going straight to the help desk, for example, or the IT department for their questions. So you can really leverage the knowledge of people inside your school for questions related to Google Apps. So to these users, you're going to provide training materials and also allow them to update these training materials. If they think that something is not clear, it's likely that the person who they're supposed to be training is not going to think it's clear either. So you want to make sure that you're allowing them to be part of the process in terms of creating training materials that are going to be shared with the wider public. You also want to figure out how long-term communication between guides will work. Should you have a group for guides, a Google group for guides that will allow them to communicate if somebody asks them a question that they don't know? Should they be able to send questions along to the help desk if they don't know? These people can really be leveraged in terms of, somebody comes in and they say, I don't know how to do this with a calendar event in Google Apps. So this person can really show the other person how to use Google Apps. One thing that maybe something that you want to think about is, should these guides have office hours? You don't want the fact that they're volunteering their time to assist their department or the grade that they work in with Google Apps to take away from also from what their core job is. We've seen this to be really effective in the faculty staff space because it makes that faculty staff feel more comfortable with the switch if they know that they have someone that's down the hall and in the next office that they can communicate with if they have questions about how to do something. So again, it's that change management piece that's important here. From a student side, what we found is that student trainings tend to be less vital, as a lot of students do have background using a lot of the consumer services. So if they do have background using Gmail, using Google Calendar, then the training is not as necessary. However, aside from Google Guides, you may also want to consider having trainings that are for at a campus level where people can come in and learn different things. So you want to set the scope of the training plan. So some things to consider are the trainings going to occur in person, or are they going to be occurring virtually? And then with that, are they going to be training videos, or are they going to be live? So the reason that's an important consideration is because if they're occurring in person, you need to make sure that you're going to have the correct size space, especially if you're inviting the campus community. If you have training videos that are in some sort of archive, then you can point users to those training videos, and it can be a lot better in terms of having that resource available afterwards. So that means even if someone misses a training session, they still have access to that information. They didn't miss it, and then now they're not able to make it up. You also want to think about how frequent will training sessions be. If you're using the Google Apps Guide mentality, then you may only have to do them before the launch, and then after the launch, you're not going to be having trainings because you'll be hoping that people will go to the Google Apps Guide. However, if you're going to be offering training sessions for your entire campus community, then you may want to say, we're going to offer these on a weekly basis until this date, say a month after your rollout. You might have different weeks with different topics, things of that nature. And then again, you also wanted to say, are they available to everyone? So can anyone stop into these, or are they available to just faculty and staff? The reason that's important, again, is from a planning perspective, you want to know how many people are going to potentially be in attendance at these trainings, especially if you're having them live and in person. You also want to consider, are these going to be trainings on just the services? Are we going to talk about things like, how do you set up an IMAP client? How do you set up a mobile device? Those are just important things when you're setting up the scope of training to think about. What topics do you want to cover? What's the end goal of these trainings? And are you expecting to cut down a significant amount of help desk volume, or do you still want people to come in so that way they can ask some questions and you can see what the questions are? So conducting the Google Apps training itself. So you want to make sure you begin training prior to your launch. That way users can prepare for the switch to Google Apps. This would be the same if you're using a Google Guides program or if you're using a more campus-wide training program. You want to start having some of them, even if this is what's going to happen on the date of our launch. That way people are aware of what's going to happen and won't have questions on the day of the launch, or it will help to reduce questions on the day of the launch. You also want to make sure that your frequently asked question pages are completed by the time you're going to do your rollout. So this is something that I think can sometimes take the back burner in terms of you're working on the technical aspects of it, you're making sure that all the users are provisioned, that their mail is migrated, that single sign-on is implemented, but the documentation is such a key piece in terms of making sure that users at least know, even if you're not going to create your own frequently asked questions content, but make sure that they know where to look on the Google side for frequently asked questions. That way they don't feel like they're stuck having to call the help desk, because for a lot of people they'd rather do self-support and not have to call somebody if they don't have to. So this is a great option for you to say, you know what, you can look up this on your own. So in summary, you want to create a project plan or project plans. You want to outline the technical objectives and requirements, the marketing objectives and requirements, and the training objectives and requirements. So even though we went over the project planning aspect first, it's likely that you're going to have marketing components on that plan and also training components on that plan. So it's important to think about all of these things ahead of time so that way you can effectively create that plan to outline all these different areas, or create multiple plans that are going to be handled by different departments. You also want to schedule regular meetings with your project team. That way you can ensure that all aspects of the project are on track. If you have these regular check-ins and you're checking in on that project plan, you can look at it and say, oh, this one task it's at 75% and it should be at 100%. How can we reorganize to make sure that we have the correct number of people on that part of the project to make sure that it's done to completion? This is going to, again, keep everyone accountable and make sure that people are able to complete their tasks on time, and also make sure that you're able to complete your rollout on time. And then also you want to make sure you're communicating with your community and involve them wherever you can. So again, if you can have contests to create logos, if you can have contests to create taglines for it, or mottos, things of that nature, posters, that's great. Once you get the excitement flowing in the community, and then they're able to serve as the advertisement as well. They'll be talking to students, will be talking to other students about it. Your faculty and staff will talk to other faculty and staff about it. So you really want to just involve your campus community in whatever ways you can. Okay, so we have time for some Q&A. So if people want to just chat any of their questions to me, that would be great. And I'm happy to answer whatever people have questions on. And if there are no questions, then I want to thank everyone for attending again. And I will be posting these in the Resource Center, so feel free to use these as your reference. Looks like a question did come in. Is it possible to add company or school logos onto Google shirts or products? So we do have some specific Gone Google gear that you can order, so then you could put your school name. I can send out a link to that information. With using some of the Google logos, some of the product logos, there are some guidelines, and I can point you to what page those are on in our EDU guide. So those are really useful. That's really useful in terms of knowing what the guidelines are in terms of, can I use this logo? Can I incorporate my own logo? Things of that nature. So we do have specific outlines in terms of how different Google logos can be used, things of that sort. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for attending, and we're excited to have you on Google Apps.